Hey everybody, I'm here with my friend Art Brown. Art
Hello.
is yeah, hey, Art is an assistant professor of communications at Milligan College. And Art, I know we met at a conference. Was it
Yeah,
UCDA?
it was UCDA when it was in Youngstown.
That's right. You came to Youngstown. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so that story I told you before the recording has some special context to it
Right.
since you had been there. Okay, cool.
And
Well,
then you came to our town last summer for the UCDA, but I was out of town. And so
that's right. Well,
yeah,
you knew I was coming, and you decided to be like, "I'm gone.
yeah, I'm out of
I'm
here.
not dealing with him again." Well, thanks for taking the time to chat with me. I'm really interested in getting a sense of your background and what you're doing
Okay.
in design. So let's start there. How in the hell did you get started in all of this?
Oh, goodness.
What was that launching point when you realized I have to be a designer or I have to
Yeah.
be creating something? What was that moment for you?
Um, I was fortunate enough as a little kid to have a lot of support. Um, I was really, really into comic books. I would say I learned to read from reading the Fantastic Four back in the 70s, and then
Spider-Man.
yeah, and then learned to draw probably from Spider-Man and the X-Men in the early 80s. And um, and around that time, is my mom was trying to make me take piano lessons, and I tried to broker a deal. I was like, "Can I take drawing lessons instead?" And she
Mhm.
said, "Sure. If you take drawing lessons, you don't have to take piano." And I knew I wanted to do something visually. Even looking back, I was really attracted to package designs, whether it was cereal or ices or type on certain types of cups for
Right.
restaurants. I was just really interested in it. And so I took drawing lessons, and then I was fortunate enough to go to a high school, take art classes there, and then get to go to a fine arts high school half a day. And I was able to take what was then labeled a commercial art course. And this was before computers were really in the classroom, believe it or not. Um, and so I did a lot of drawing with a really with a commercial edge to it, but we just did a lot of drawing for about 3 hours a day, and that was great. And and I knew I wanted to do something art related. In the back of my head is like, I wonder if I can be a comic book artist, but I quickly learned I don't work fast enough.
Hmm.
And that's just sort of, it's just one of those things I'm probably not going to get a chance to do, especially not being in New York or being networked with certain people. And that wasn't realistic. And so I was an art major at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina. Um, for 1 year, and then I met my future wife there. Ran off and got married at 19, and then had a kid at 21. And so here I am, a sophomore in college, trying to figure out, okay, I've got to work. I have to sort things out. And so we both ended up at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee,
Hmm.
and so I was one of those students that, well, I was one of those students that I worked 40 hours a week and went to school full time and did all of my classwork and any sort of assignments. That happened between midnight and about 3 a.m. And then I
Right.
hit it all again the next day. And so I didn't sleep for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, if it wasn't the homework keeping you up, it was definitely the kid.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so my I was still wondering, it's like, what am I going to do? I have to be able to make money. I want to do something with the arts, but I was having to look at other situations too. And about that time, I took my first required graphic design course at ETSU in spring of 1991.
Hmm.
And we had, I believe, six Classics, and then two other computers with color monitors. And as soon as I took that class, I was like, okay, I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
At that same time, I also got a job working back then it was Kinko's Copy Center, but we know it as FedEx Office now. But that allowed me to have access to equipment and
Hmm.
color printers and just to understand at least the printing process and to understand digital design a lot more, even though it was very low end. It was a Kinko's, but still
Right.
it was a chance to be around that industry, even though it's sort of this vendor in a vendor capacity, I guess.
Right.
And so I managed to get out of school in the fall of '95. I had an internship in the next month, and then I got my first full-time job that started in March of the next year, working for a small agency that was growing really, really fast. And they did a lot of work with healthcare, tourism, later a NASCAR speedway. And then that grew into a lot of other things. And so that started my agency design life that lasted for about 14 years. And the weird thing about that was that I worked in the same building for 3 different agencies, believe it or not. Every time I started looking around for different agencies and started looking to other job prospects, we would get bought out or merged with somebody else. It's like, you know what, I'm going to see how this goes.
Right.
And it was a good thing. And about that time, especially during the last buyout, my son was starting high school. It's like, I need something very stable because I have to think about him going to college in about 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so work or family very much affected my work at the time. And looking back, I probably didn't get to take as many risks as I could have, but I had to, do what I could at the time. So that was my agency life, I guess, until the economic downturn of 2008 and 9. And around that time, my clients were tourism for the most part, for Northeast Tennessee, Southwest Virginia. So mountains, music, and nobody
Drinking.
and nobody was spending money. Therefore, the tax revenue was not coming in, and therefore my tourism clients, that business dried up. And so at the time, that last buyout was an agency out of Knoxville, Tennessee, that had bought our office because we were competing with them, and so they bought us. And so that was when I was still working part-time for them. I was having to suddenly freelance after being really not having many side gigs because I had agency life and then a family life. And suddenly I was on my own trying to figure things out, and which I really had not been doing. It's like, well, things are stable. I don't have to freelance that much.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly I was, and around that time, just in a small region, especially in our market, you have a lot of businesses that don't value design anyway. And then suddenly when funds are low, they definitely don't value it then. And then all of the agencies, that there was no freelance agency work to be had because everybody was circling the wagons, just trying to hold their own so they didn't have to let people go. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting. It was, I think it might have been your phrase in another interview or something. I did a lot of horrible logos for horrible people.
I say that a lot.
I ran into that myself, and I think some of them still owe me some money too. Looking back at it, I'm still bitter about that. But
you always will remember the people that don't pay you back.
Oh,
always.
Yeah. And so, so to go backward just a little bit before the last buyout and before the economic downturn, I had taught, my wife and I teach at the same college, and she's a chair of the music department. And she introduced me to the chair over the performing arts and communications. And I met her back in 2004. Mm-hmm. And she says, I'm thinking about adding graphic design to our comm department. Are you interested? And I said, yeah. And so we met, talked about what courses would need to be offered. And this is 2004.
Right.
And to sort of go along with that, I met at ETSU just to see with my former professors there just to see how can I get into grad school and get credentials to teach. Can I start that process? Sadly, right after that meeting, I got a call from my boss. She said, I need to meet you downtown, and just said, by the way, you're now creative director. We just fired our other partners in the business. You're now in charge of the creative department. So that put things on hold another 5 years.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so, I mean, during that time I was working for a large agency based out of Knoxville. I had some of my best projects there. I always tell my students my favorite projects and least favorite. This one was for Buena Vista Home Entertainment, aka Disney, and it was for the European DVD release of, I think it was Sleeping Beauty and 101 Dalmatians. And so we were hired to come up with these crazy promotion ideas that would happen in Europe. It made it through about 4 management levels, and then for the last level, they decided, nah, we're going to save money. We'll just use key art. It's like, oh, but it was the best project I ever worked on because I'm getting to watch animated films for work, and I'm getting to analyze those and base my design concepts based on Sleeping Beauty's dress or the puppies from 101 Dalmatians. And so, yeah, by the way, least favorite project was observing an open heart surgery before the cardio surgeons would take part in the campaign we were trying to shoot that day at a hospital. Oh, yeah, that was bad.
You had to watch it?
Oh, yeah. It was like Kramer and Seinfeld, the episode with the junior mints. Yeah. So if you ever, so for everyone out there, if you have to have surgery, check those forms. And there's that section about photographing and marketing. Yeah, make sure you put a big X through that, because that was creepy for me. I didn't like it. So basically I had to look down into an old man's chest cavity as he was having open heart surgery. So I use that as a horror tale to my students.
Wow. Yeah. I think I want that experience.
No.
I don't know. It's appealing to me. I don't know. It's very macabre.
You can prepare yourself for the visuals. You cannot prepare yourself for the smells. That's all I will say.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It's the smell. Interesting.
Yeah.
So there's some other sensory experiences related to that. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah. So during the economic downturn, I was freelancing. I was working part-time at that same agency. I did work half a day. That was difficult because you can't really execute a campaign and turn in and really get it done in a decent, in a quick manner by only working half a day. And so it was causing problems.
It's like incremental progress.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm suddenly working, much slower than everyone else. And it was for a bank client, and we were needing to execute this thing. So like, well, either give me extra hours to work on it, or you're going to have to slow down or we're going to have to change the timeline, So, but around that time I got offered a chance to teach. That same department chair, based on just my work experience at that point, it was 14 or 15 years. She said, if you're cross-listed with me, I can let you teach InDesign because we haven't taught this course in 3 years. We have to offer it now for our seniors. Can you come teach the class? I said, sure. It's like, and so that was my first time teaching. I was teaching InDesign. I think it was CS3.
I remember that one.
Yeah. And I'd already started the application for grad school that previous fall. It's just like, I'm not really liking freelance. Maybe this is the perfect chance to go back to school anyway. And I can at least get a full-time year in before I start working again. And that's really what I did. It took me 4.5 years to get through a 3-year program in grad school because I was also started working full-time again at the same time. And but was beginning to teach. And then I was able to be a teaching assistant in grad school as well. So a teaching grad assistant at ETSU. I was teaching just the basic intro to graphic design. This is Photoshop. This is Illustrator class.
And that's where you got your MFA?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I eventually got my MFA there, and have been I had also been adjuncting at Milligan at the same time. I was in grad school. And at that same time, a job opening came open at Milligan in their PR and marketing office. So I worked part-time as a in-house designer for Milligan College, was adjuncting there and teaching at ETSU, and was a full-time grad student at the
You
same
were
time.
busy.
And trying to freelance, but eventually I had to give my clients for freelance work away. I knew
Yeah.
somebody that would take care of them. It's like, I can't devote the time, and I'm trying to go to grad school to get my MFA so I can teach.
Right.
And I need to pass you guys to this person. He will take good care of you. And that's what I ended up doing.
Quite the long and winding road to your present position, right?
Yeah. And so eventually during that time I was adjuncting, I actually developed a graphic design minor. We still have a major and minor system at Milligan. We're a small liberal arts college, and so we have majors and minors, and we developed a graphic design minor, and then the interest in that was high. So we developed a graphic design major that I got to build, and it sort of lives within the communications department. And I've been teaching full-time at Milligan since fall of 2016.
Cool. That's great. I love your story. I mean, it's layered. You've got a lot going on, but I think the thing that resonates with me is that you were able to practice while learning and teaching.
Yes.
And your entire world at that point was design in one way or another. So you were fully immersive. And out of curiosity, do you feel like at that point in time, like, did you feel like you were at like the top of your game? Like,
no, I had lost.
Not at all.
I'll be honest. I had lost so much sleep that I was kind of struggling, and it did affect sort of the direction I took in grad school for my graphic design MFA, believe it or not. But it took. I'll be honest, after my agency experience, I was a little bit burned out. The end of that was not a good experience. And it took teaching design to sort of rekindle my love for design at that point. And then once I was able to sort of get my head around that and then teach more, then I was able to go back and design more effectively, I think.
Yeah.
It was immersive, but probably way too many hours of the day. Yeah.
Well, for your students are certainly benefiting from your lack of sleep, at least during that time, because, and I don't know if your experiences differ here, but one of the things that I've found throughout my teaching background is that the students are getting enough practice work in the classroom. They're getting the philosophy, they're getting the principles, the ideologies, etc. But they're coming up short on research, and then also the practical side of things. So, you're bringing a career's worth of practical wisdom and knowledge to the classroom, and your students are going to be more prepared to graduate and then and transition into the industry smoothly because of your experience, or even transition smoothly into like a freelancing gig. And maybe someday they decide to start their own practice. I found that, a lot of design professors, they take themselves out of practice completely. And they'll do like one project a year. And I'm at that point where it's like, I can't imagine not doing less than 10 projects a year. Like, I have to keep producing for the benefit of my students. Yeah. So where do you stand on that? Where do you think, where are the gaps in design ed right now?
Oh, I know. I also, Thankfully, I still have a lot of contacts in our market, and I maintain those through the AAF and now AIGA, and I keep looking for new opportunities constantly for my students. But I think a lot of them just say, we expect the software knowledge, that's a given. We want students to understand that we're hiring them to come up with ideas. We want to know how well they can. We want to have confidence they can work with some of our clients, and then they just really want students to they see the gap, and either from nearby schools, and they came to me. It's like, while you're rebuilding your department, please keep this in mind, because we would like to offer some internships or something, because we just want your students to have a better idea of the business when they leave, so they don't have to go through that weird first year transition of designer just really not understanding that it's the client that pays the bills, not understanding how a design concept turns into a campaign, a marketing campaign, and it's having that sort of that business savvy approach is they just say that's sometimes missing in our region, and from students that are just graduating. So they wanted more, and so I'm packing more of that, and just it affects sort of how I teach.
Yeah.
And yet, like you mentioned, I can always give them sort of an insight of this is what's going to happen after you graduate, and so whether it's your first job, because I used to be in charge of hiring somebody and can assess a portfolio very quickly. And I said, in less than a minute, they can assess if you have the software skills.
Right.
And if you can get their attention with portfolio pieces, then you can talk about your ideas, and then that's when the real interview starts. And so, yeah, that's sort of, I think I meandered there, but
that's okay. That's okay, because we're going to meander into a different aspect of the conversation.
Sure.
I'm interested in learning about your experiences with self-isolation because of the coronavirus, and how is that affecting not just your teaching, but your actual design? Like, if you're designing something right now, how is that affecting the quality of your work? And then also the same questions, but from the side of your students, how are they reacting to this? How are they coping?
I will say up front that I am also one of those professors that does less design work, but I sort of went into a side tangent where my design or my illustrations and design turned into more fine art. And so that in the academic world, that just counts as creative activity toward your tenure book and your
scholarship. Right.
And so I've had more success with that. And it also, when I stopped designing professionally, I was in a small market and I was really bound by a lot of non-compete clauses. I had clients that wanted to work with me, but because they still had a credit with agencies I used to work for, they would prepay a whole year ahead of time. And so they would have a $5,000 balance with a nearby Fortune 500 company. They wanted to work with me. I wanted to work with them. But if I worked with them, I was going to get sued.
Yeah.
And so I stopped doing a lot after I started teaching, especially just because the relationships I had, I couldn't push forward with those. And so my work, this was also my grad school direction as well, because I was working full time and had to do something different than sit at a computer for another 8 hours a day. And so I started doing a lot of letterpress printing, a lot of more illustration, a lot of linoleum cuts, and then turning those into more political illustrations. That's what I end up doing on my own. Just instead of, I do some design work still, just not as much, and push forward because it ends up sort of counting as graphic design history for what I also teach that course as well. So it helps inform my teaching, just going through a different process, but it's sort of a sidetrack to commercial graphic design. But so it hasn't affected my design work that much, just being stuck at home. Teaching, to me, it slows things down because I can assess from the back of the classroom, looking at the computer monitors, just walking up the rows in the lab. I can figure out where everybody who's working hard, who is slacking, who's having trouble, and I can figure that out in a minute. And it really bothers me that now I have students, there are students that keep in touch with me. I offer Zoom meetings. I record videos I have a module just for answers to questions for every course. I record videos saying, okay, now this is how you use the type on a path tool in InDesign. I had a student ask me that, and this is how you do it. And so I record a lot of those during the day. I have meetings via Zoom with students, and then I have that section of students that just has disappeared. I have check-in dates for the project. They'll send something in, but their progress really isn't that good. I've had to adjust deadlines because I had to wait on the college to mail laptops to a few students. Then I have some students that are home insecure right now. I had a particular student that I worry about, but I can't do anything about it. They choose not to take advantage of the counseling center that's even online at school. And I believe they were in the process of coming out right around the time they got sent back home, and it did not go over well with their family. So I have a few really good design students that are struggling at the same time. And so between that, adjusting deadlines and just trying to get the seniors in a place where they're ready to graduate. I have a student in the middle of doing research right now and getting ready to give a research presentation online about Bauhaus. And they're trying to explain Bauhaus in 15 minutes or less.
Good luck.
Yeah, that's not an easy thing. And so it has been a challenge, and students are just worried because suddenly we had the American Advertising Awards on February 29th. My students won awards. Agencies were there actively making contact and say, hey, we're going to get in touch with you. We want to interview you. Then suddenly everyone was sequestered and stuck at home. And so suddenly a promising, aggressive hiring from agencies and really a good market locally has come to a halt. And so I now have students like, I sent them my portfolio, but I haven't heard back. What do I do? And so we're still trying to think through that. I've offered them, just really offer to be a part of a solution is the best way. Say, I know we were talking before. I know the hiring situation has probably changed, especially with client work. But if I need to draw paths around photos or if I need to resize ads, I'm available. I want to learn and I want to be a part of your company, and I'm ready to work. I'm set up at home. I can also do photography, It's offer to be a part of a solution, but you're also at the same time not trying to annoy them. And so that's where it's really gotten weird for my seniors. It bothers me a lot that these are seniors that have worked hard. They've done everything they're supposed to have done. They were on the brink of getting hired and having that interview.
The bottom was pulled out from under them.
It's just disappeared now, and it's just radio silence from agencies at this point. I'm on the education board for the AAF, and we're trying to set up our online portfolio review. It's an event that originally I would have hosted this past Tuesday evening, and now we're trying to figure out how do we turn this into a Zoom interview with a list of people who are participating. But still, for a student, that just sucks. You don't get that in person, even though it's a speed dating type of interview situation. You don't get to make that contact. They don't get that really good first impression from meeting them in person. And it's unfortunate. It makes me a little bit mad. I'm upset about it. And so, I empathize with that. And, it's similar with my students, that it feels like one great big false start. They're ready to go, and then the bottom falls out and they don't know what to do, where to go, etc. And I think your advice, the advice that you're giving your students, just being a part of the solution, is really quite apt and the best thing that you could say, because there's any number of different ways to provide a solution. You don't necessarily have to be in person to do that. And I'm trying to tell my students that, like,
hey, you're not able to meet some of these people in person, but if you have the means and the motivation, you can still progress your career forward. Get involved find some problems,
right.
Like willingly get involved in some problems and provide those solutions, be it pro bono or, nonprofits would especially love help right now, especially on the marketing and comms side. They absolutely need help in getting their programs out. For example, I was on a Zoom call with a colleague who just lives down the road from me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, oh yeah, the doorbell rang and food was here. So basically the local church is providing food for, 3,000 people. She's like, wow. Oh, I didn't even know about that. And I'm thinking like, probably because the church doesn't have a comms person to really promote this. So how much food are they really wasting? So that, in situations like that, especially for the students, it actually gives them a great deal of self-worth and value to be able to solve complex problems like that they didn't think design could necessarily do.
Yeah. So, and my other advice for them is, yes, you have to be flexible. You have to be able to adapt quickly. If there's something you feel you're weak at, fill in that gap and take this time to learn. And most of all, be visible. Network, even though, yes, we're not having in-person meetings. The AAF will be doing some things locally. Thankfully, there is a new chapter for the AIGA in Asheville, North Carolina, which is about an hour from our campus across the state line. Mm-hmm. They are also very active. And the other chapter is in Knoxville, which is about 2 hours from our campus. And so it's just be visible, make those contacts any way you can. I always tell them, for lack of a better word, stalk these companies on social media, whether it's LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Know what they're doing, know who the players are, and make those contacts as you can.
Yep. Absolutely.
But be visible in the community and be able to show something you're doing.
Perfect. You can still be visible and still be present, just not literally.
Right.
And really and that's an easy thing to say, obviously, how some people are dealing with, or coping with having to be inside and self-isolating, can be a challenge to that. But like I said earlier, if you have the means and the motivation to sort of be more extroverted and put yourself out there, you'll see some return on that. But it's hard. So I just had like one last question for you. I wanted to talk about comic books. So you strike me as a Marvel guy.
Yes.
Yeah. As am I. I complete love for DC, but I'm a Marvel guy through and through. So let's nerd out a little bit. What books are you reading right now, if any?
I'm not reading any current work. Okay. I recently went back and bought reprints of all of Walter Simonson's Thor run from the 80s. Mm. I was a big fan of the X-Men in the early 80s.
Claremont X-Men?
My favorite was Paul Smith, and then John Romita Jr.
Yeah.
Then it just sort of got weird after that. The writing just took a nosedive after that run.
The 90s hit.
Yeah.
This? Yeah. And I know what you're saying. I can't articulate it, but Days of Future Past is certainly within your interest area. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, Claremont and Byrne run for the X-Men. The run of Spider-Man around that time was also really good. You also had John Byrne on Fantastic Four, and you had Simonson on Thor. And I think a lot of those runs still hold up. So I find myself just going back, and especially I think, even though I didn't read them at the time in the 80s, I went back and read the Thor stuff. And other than a few pop culture-y things that are inserted, it holds up pretty well. And so I completely nerd out on old comics podcasts.
Yeah.
And it's something to listen to while I work. And yeah.
So I cut my teeth on comics in the 90s, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
X-Men, well, first off, Spider-Man is without a doubt the end-all be-all best superhero for me. Like, I'll always be a diehard Spider-Man fan. But I was a big Cap guy as well. So, the non-X-Men heroes
Mhm.
they were really my sweet spot. But I was a huge fan of all the toys. I think I had
Mhm.
everything. The 90s was great for comic properties,
True.
especially the toys. Um,
I remember going into stores back then because my son would have been like 2, 3, 4. And we would go into the toy stores. It's like I would see the X-Men toys or the Spider-Man toys off to the side. It's like,
yeah.
man, I wish we would have had those when I was a kid. Where were
Yeah,
those?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably had, if anything, those very unposable Marvel Secret Wars
Yeah, those came out
toy.
around, they would have come out when I was around in 7th grade. So I wasn't buying them that much.
You had
But
the Magos too.
yeah,
Yeah.
those would not withstand play.
No,
Uh, I just
not at
remember
all.
throwing my Spider-Man up in the air. He landed on the sidewalk and just blew into a million pieces. And so all I had left was a little Spider-Man suit with one arm hanging out of it. So I was like, okay, well, and thankfully Star Wars happened. So,
Yes. Well, the one thing I wanted to tell you is that even though, like, I'm a total 90s kid when it comes to comics, my
mhm,
favorite artists, John Buscema, Jack Kirby,
mhm.
and even Stan Lee's writing back in the day, like in those 60s comic books,
Yeah.
was just really awesome. I bought Stan Lee, John Buscema, Silver Surfer trade
Mhm.
paperback. And one of the things I liked about the Silver Surfer is just how eloquent he was. Like, you could tell, like, that is Stan actually just writing poetry.
Yeah.
So
I find myself going back and looking at a lot of Bill Sienkiewicz's work from New Mutants in the 80s, because
yeah,
that was my first, that could be safely, I could say that was my first introduction to any sort of expressionism or even abstract art, was trying to dig through an X-Men related comic that was painted and weird. The characters were distorted. It was pretty much Egon Schiele in comic book form. And that was my first uh, introduction to any sort of abstract art. And it made a big impression. I even find my artwork now, I'd say Sienkiewicz's version of Warlock, which is
hmm
this morphing mechanical character, has worked its way into my artwork and still comes out in my artwork now, even though it was something that got burned into my brain in fall of 1984. So
right.
yeah, so it's all still in my head.
Awesome. Well, Art, this has been great. I really appreciate your insights and your your knowledge on the subject, and exploring some of your history, and of course talking about comic books, which
Oh yeah,
I think we could do all day.
yeah.
But yeah, thanks again, and stay safe out there.
Oh, you too. Thank you.